I'd like to welcome you back to today's Anthony Jordan lectures. To begin today, I won't repeat the litany of Father Komonchak's many degrees and publications, as I mentioned that yesterday when I introduced him, simply to say that we're very happy to have him here in terms of the understanding of the theology of surrounding the Second Vatican Council and its reception, especially in the English-speaking world. His work has played a significant role, and today we're happy to have him here to speak on the topic, Sed in quibus, in whom does the Church live? So please join me in welcoming Father Komonchak.
The Second Vatican Council ended on December 8th, 1965, and part of the final ceremony was the occasion when Pope Paul VI had read out several brief statements addressed to several groups of people, leaders of nations, intellectuals and scientists, artists, women. There wasn't one addressed to men. The poor, the sick and suffering, workers, and young people. The intention was to show the Church's esteem for them and to offer a word of encouragement to each specific group. Father Congar, who kept a diary during the council, noted in it that some of these addresses, these brief messages, made it appear as if the Church stood over and against these groups, as if it were something distinct from them, as if they were not part of the Church. He asked himself in a Latin phrase, pro quo supponit ecclesia? What is meant by the word church here in these addresses? To what did it refer? What underlies? What's the reality underlying the word that's being used? Congar asked that question in some other writings, I will get to this in a minute, when he spoke of the Church as mother. He did an essay on the meaning of this notion in the early Church. Did it refer to the hierarchy? Does it refer to the entire Church? He wrote a little book that has a section on the council statement that the Church is the sacrament of salvation. But he asked a question that many theologians didn't ask. In whom is the Church the sacrament of salvation? St. Augustine asked a similar question, the one that's in my title. In Psalm 127, 128, 3, you find the phrase, "Your wife is a fruitful vine on the recesses, on the sides of your house." And as usual, St. Augustine, when he came to this person who was being praised in the psalm and said he will enjoy all blessings, he said that the psalm was referring, of course, to Christ, and therefore his wife must be the Church. And then he said, this refers to his wife, this refers to us, but then went on to ask, well, in whom, in quibus, is the Church a fruitful vine? And looking at his audience, as we will see, he gave an explanation of this that might not have pleased everyone there. That question I always want to ask, in whom is what you're saying about the Church true? Who do you mean by it when you use the term? Does it refer to someone? Does it have to refer to someone or to someones for it to be true of the Church? Do you mean it when you say the Church? Do you mean the hierarchy, bishops, the Pope, the Roman Curia? Is it not quite common to leave statements about the Church unspecified, unexplained, as if it's true of some vague entity, invoked in the third person, standing over and against us, the Church? I must say the question often arises for me when I read a papal or a Roman or a episcopal statement that's talking about what the church is, what the church thinks, what the church feels, what the church is doing. I wonder, what does the church stand for in some of these statements? It's a bit like, you've seen athletes on television who are being asked about something, and so you get Michael Jordan being interviewed or Wayne Gretzky being interviewed, and Wayne Gretzky starts speaking about Wayne Gretzky as if in the third person. You've seen things like that. Well, Michael Jordan doesn't think that way, Michael Jordan says, okay? Well, sometimes you get the bishop saying, well, the church says this, the church says that. Then there's the further question about whether it's true what is said. Is it enough for a bishop to say the church is opposed to racism for it to be true that the church is opposed to racism? Or is that another question? Sociologists often try to overcome something they call reification, thingification. And this refers to what Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman call the apprehension of the products of human activity as if they were something else than human products, such as facts of nature, results of cosmic laws, or manifestations of divine will. The apprehension of realities that are the result of human actions as if they were not the result of human actions, or overlooking the fact that they are the results of human actions. The temptation to do this is perhaps unavoidable, since we human beings are born into a world which, in its massive objectivity, stands over and against each one of us as we emerge from the womb. And it stands over and against us not only with its rocks and trees and cats and dogs, but also with its mothers and fathers and families and communities and societies, people who speak to us in languages of their own and thus introduce us into their world, whose example offers models for us to imitate and roles to assume within institutions. Recall how, we used to say, be a good little boy to a child, be a good little girl. I once had my head handed to me by my sisters when I said to one of my young nephews, "You're acting like a little girl." My sisters said, "And how do little girls act?" Okay. Correcting me. I had 10 sisters, so you see I got a lot of correction. So. Now, St. Augustine was quite well aware of this. In one place, he refers to this vast social and cultural fabric into which we are born as another maternal womb. He says, "My mother's womb was the customs of my city." He noted how inevitable it is that with our mother's milk, we drink in also what our parents and grandparents, our forebears, think of the world and how to get on within it. Only later do we discover that this whole fabric was knit together by generations before us and is being sustained or altered by the generation now living as we constitute the social and cultural world into which a new generation is going to be born. Some of us may remember it as a bit of shock to discover, perhaps by a visit to a friend's house, that not every family displays the same dynamics that ours does, or to find by traveling that other people have other ways of ordering daily life, to find that there are people who think it's silly to regard another human being as a king or a queen or a pope. The discovery that all of these social and cultural realities, institutions, roles, the discovery that they are the product of human activity can introduce a certain metaphysical vertigo as you feel what you thought was solid ground shift and quake under your feet. The debate about gay marriage, for example, today pits those who think what counts as a marriage to be entirely a matter for individuals and societies to decide against others who think that marriage between a man and a woman is normative because it's divinely ordained, or think of the argument that what is called gender is a social construct. I'm trying to draw attention to this and often to the discovery, and that this applies in areas that we don't want it to apply to. The danger of reification is particularly strong in the case of the church, because for Christian believers, the church is indeed one of those things mentioned by Berger and Luckman, namely a manifestation of divine will. Did not Christ promise that he would build his church on the rock? Is not the church called God's people, Christ's body, the Spirit's temple? The answer to these questions, of course, is yes. The church exists in virtue of God's will. One could derive from the text of the Second Vatican Council a set of what I have elsewhere called the divine principle of the church's constitution, the call of God, the grace of the word of Christ, the grace of the Spirit, along with the four pillars of the church that they make possible: an apostolic rule of faith, creed, the canon of the scriptures, set of sacraments, a structure of ministry, all of which are said to exist in the church by God's will. So whatever a critique of reification, thingification in our notion of the church might mean, it cannot mean eliminating or even downplaying the divine initiative in the constitution and life of the church. But is the only way to safeguard the divine element in the constitution of the church by, and here's a big word, hypostasizing the church. That is, treating the church as if it is a supra-personal entity over and above its members. One sometimes hears theologians warning against thinking that warning us that the church is more than the sum of its members. Although it's rather rarer for those same theologians to explain what this more is that the church is than its sum of its members. And they also often fail to recognize that so is a committee in a university, an ad hoc committee appointed to do such and such, is more than the sum of its members. But when you say that of the church is more than the sum of its members, what do you mean by it? What is this more? There have been theologians who have argued that the church is a person in her own right. And I say her own right because the person who is described is usually considered to be female. Jacques Maritain and Charles Jouanet argued that the church is a person with a subsistence of its own that's distinct from the subsistence of all of its members. Father Congar and Father de Lubac, Henri de Lubac, both distinguished two aspects of the church, which they insisted were not to be separated. But Father de Lubac named them in a way that encouraged precisely that to happen. He spoke of the distinction between the Ecclesia Convocans and the Ecclesia Convocata. Ecclesia Convocans means the gathering church, the church that gathers, and that refers to the church as calling people to Christ and introducing them into her life, which is where perhaps the motherhood of the church would be thought to be found. The other, the Ecclesia Convocata, is the gathered church, consisting of the people who have been brought together by the word and grace of Christ. Father Congar seemed to approve of this distinction. He himself made the distinction between the church as the instrument or institution of Christ's salvific work and the church as the community of believers. I must say I have become suspicious of late of this distinction because it so easily does become a separation. And the separation consists in abstracting that first, the Ecclesia Convocans, the gathering church, that is the instrument of God's calling his people together, and of forgetting that at any moment in the church's history, including this moment today, the gathering church is precisely the church that's been gathered. At any moment The church that is calling people to Christ is the church that has been called to Christ. And if you ask those questions and try to make that case, then in fact is it not the case that all of those people and the acts and words by which they convoke the church suffer from their limitations, their weaknesses, even their sins? When Vatican II spoke of the church as the sign and instrument of God's work in the world, it meant that the church was both the effect, the sign, and the instrument of salvation, but the Council did not spend much time exploring whether the church's effectiveness as an instrument was not dependent upon the degree to which it is a sign or an effect of grace. Finally, one of the factors that encourages this hypostasizing or reifying of the church is the Catholic doctrine of the sacraments, and in particular the doctrine of the ex opere operato efficacy of the sacraments. And St. Augustine, of course, is one of the great originators of this teaching. The sacraments, especially baptism and the Eucharist, are understood to be generative of the church, and their efficacy not to depend upon the holiness of the minister, which is a doctrine I think we can all be comforted by. I'd hate to go back and have to inquire into the holiness of the person who baptized me to find out whether my baptism was valid. Okay. It's an important principle. And the Donatists, as Augustine understood them at least, were of the view that in fact the validity of a sacrament depended upon the holiness of the minister. To that notion, St. Augustine opposed the truth, as he saw it, that the principal agent, the principal minister, the principal subject of the sacraments is God, Christ, the Spirit. And in a couple of places he has the famous statement, if Peter baptizes, it's Christ who is baptizing. If Paul baptizes, it is Christ who is baptizing. If Judas baptizes, it is Christ who is baptizing. Now, I think what has happened at times is that this emphasis upon this, the ex opere operato, efficacy of the sacraments, has been extended illegitimately to other areas of the Church's ministries, almost as if it applies as well to the Church's teaching, that it applies as well to the Church's governance, to the point where it appears that the Church, in a sense, also comes to be, operates by itself, and that the activity of the Church is principally the work of its ordained ministries. Now, with all of that as a kind of background, let us look at a view of the Church that I don't think has received enough attention in St. Augustine. It's what I mentioned yesterday when I spoke of the Church as the place where the event of conversion takes place, and as the result of that event. And I recognize that's a rather cryptic comment. I'm referring to the way in which St. Augustine develops certain prominent metaphors or images of the Church. Let me simply state a few of them. For Augustine, the Church is both a building, a house or a city, and those who enter it. The Church is both a mother and her children, a single temple if its members are temples of God. The Church is God's tent on earth and those who dwell in it. The Church is a boat and its seasick passengers. And I want to illustrate some of these, not all of them, but some of these with some texts. Let's begin with the image of the Church as a mother, Ecclesia Mater, which is a very ancient and well-loved metaphor in the Northern African Church. The image, no doubt, for a variety of reasons, has fallen out of favor. At least you don't hear it as much anymore as one did before. Father Congar has pointed out that this image of the motherhood of the Church is one of those designations that over the centuries was given a juridical meaning, so that Mother Church became a term of authority, referring in particular to the supra-personal institution that mediates salvation, gives birth to the faithful as her children, and over whom she closely watches and warns. So the church as mater et magistra, mother and teacher. When I ask people what comes to mind when they hear the phrase, Holy Mother the Church, they almost always reply, the hierarchy, Rome, the Vatican. That's Holy Mother the Church. There's a story that was told of many years ago that Cardinal Medeiros, who was the Archbishop of Boston, was asked what he thought about the ordination of women. And he says, "Oh, Father, I don't think I would be in favor of the ordination of women." He said, "I am afraid that if that happened, the church would lose her male character." I'm afraid if that happened, the church would lose her male character. You can see how these things get mixed up. Okay. Now, originally, the maternal metaphor, the motherhood metaphor, applied not to those in authority in the church, not to some suprapersonal entity, but to the whole church and to all of her members. And it had immediate and concrete reference. It was an image for the part that all Christians could play in bringing people to birth in Christ, even in bringing Christ to birth in them, and in nurturing this new life within them. Listen to two texts of St. Augustine on this. The church is in herself both a mother and her children. For all of those of whom the church consists, taken together, are said to be a mother, while those same individuals, taken singly, taken individually, are said to be her children. And the other text, we are called children of that mother, even though she consists of us. We are called children of that mother, even though she consists of us. Individually, we are all children of Mother Church, but taken together, we are Mother Church. It's worth thinking about that. What does it mean? St. Augustine gave it a concrete meaning. He at one point notes that Christ referred to his disciples even as his own mothers. Those who are children of Mother Church become Mother Church, he said, when they bring people to the baptismal font. Now, the paradox is that the church becomes a mother through the actions of her children. Some examples. At one point, an urgent prayer was delivered up from Augustine's congregation, and when it was heard, Augustine said it was Mater Ecclesiae, it was Mother Church whose prayer was heard. When mothers brought their newborn infants to be baptized, it was Mother Church that was bringing them. Too young to walk to the church, these newborn infants, Augustine said, Mother Church provides them with the feet of others so they can come, with the heart of others so they can believe, with the tongue of others so they can confess the faith. There's no type of sin which causes the church to neglect the viscera materna, to forget the child of her womb, and to provide the possibility of reconciliation. When he was addressing people who were preparing for baptism, he said, the church is now experiencing labor pains over you because, like Rebekah in the Old Testament, good and bad people are fighting within her womb. Augustine even extended the maternal metaphor to show how Christians could be considered mothers of Christ. Did not Christ say as much? He said, I know it's going to be strange. You can understand how you were a brother of Christ, a sister of Christ, even a child of Christ. How can you be said to be a mother of Christ? Well, that's what Christ said, because remember the scene in which they come and say, your mother and your brethren are standing outside. And Jesus looks out and points out and says, and who is my mother? Who are my brethren? Whoever does the will of my Father, that person is a brother to me and a sister and a mother. Well, it's easy to understand what it means to be a brother or a sister, but what does it mean for me to be a mother of Christ? And I'm going to go through a rather lengthy text to show you how he develops this. Come on now, friends, he says. Think of how the church, which is plain enough, is the bride of Christ. What's more difficult to understand, but is true all the same, is that she is the mother of Christ. The Virgin Mary came first as a representative figure of the church. Now, how, I ask you, can Mary be the mother of Christ except by giving birth to the limbs and organs of Christ? She gave birth to Christ and all of his members. You people, to whom I'm speaking, you are the limbs and the organs of the members of Christ. Who gave you birth? He's looking at his congregation. Who gave you birth? And he said, I can already hear you answering, Mother Church gave me birth. This holy and honorable Mother Church, is like Mary in that she both gives birth and is a virgin. That she gives birth, I can prove by pointing to you. You were born of her. She gives birth to Christ because you are the members of Christ. Okay, I have proved that the church gives birth. Now let me prove that she is a virgin. The divine evidence does not let me down. No, it doesn't. There is what St. Paul said, 2 Corinthians 11, 2-3. I have betrothed you, in the plural, he's addressing the Corinthians, I have betrothed you, in the plural, to one husband, to present you, in the plural, as a chaste virgin to Christ. Chaste virgin in the singular. Okay, what does this virginity consist in? How is he afraid that it might be corrupted? Well, let St. Paul explain. I have betrothed you to one husband to present you as a chaste virgin to Christ, but I am afraid that as the serpent led Eve astray with its cunning, so too your minds may be corrupted from the chastity which is in Christ. That's the end of the quotation from St. Paul. Preserve that virginity in your minds. Virginity of the mind is the integrity of Catholic faith. In the same way as Eve was corrupted by the serpent's talk, so must the church remain a virgin by the gift of the Almighty. And so, just as Mary gave birth in her womb as a virgin to Christ, so let the members of Christ, you people, give birth in their minds. And in this way, you will be mothers of Christ. It's not something out of your reach. It's not something beyond your powers. It's not something incompatible with what you are. You became children of Mother Church. Become mothers also. You were the mother's children when you were baptized. Then you were born as members of Christ. Bring whomever you can along to the bath of baptism, so that just as you became children when you were born, when you were baptized, you may likewise be able, by bringing others along to be born, to become mothers of Christ as well. That's the end of my quotation from Augustine. It's from his Sermon 73, number 8. Now, what I find fascinating about this long paragraph is that Augustine does not shy away from difficult questions. He knows very well that in his congregation there are few virgins in the physical sense. But the same was true, of course, of the Corinthians when St. Paul wrote to them. So there had to be a metaphorical meaning that St. Paul intended. And in fact, as Augustine develops his exegesis of this passage, it becomes very close to what the modern scholars say about this metaphor in St. Paul. Where St. Paul is there, he's concerned about false teachers coming in and leading the Corinthians away. And so he uses this metaphor. I betrothed you. In other words, I engaged you. It's not the wedding yet. You're betrothed. I engaged all of you as a chaste virgin for Christ, who will be the husband. Okay. But I am afraid that just as the devil seduced Eve and so also he will seduce you and move you away from the teaching which I have given to you. And so Augustine says, virginity of the church is virginity of the mind, of the heart. It's integrity of faith, of hope, and of love. Now, I would be willing to bet that it's some time since you've had many preachers talk about the virginity of the church. Preachers have a tendency when they come to a text like that, says, well, we'll leave that. Let's talk about the gospel. Okay. But St. Augustine thought these metaphors actually had meaning, and it had meaning in reference to the church, the community. And it wasn't Virgin Mother Church as off in the sky someplace. This is Virgin Mother Church. Individually, you're all children of Mother Church, but who is Mother Church? Mother Church is all of us taken together. He also has some wonderful expositions, which I can't go in today, about Mother Charity. And he illustrates Mother Charity, the maternal aspect of love, through St. Paul, who in 1 Thessalonians describes himself as a tender nurse. And in Galatians says, oh, you Galatians, with whom I am in labor again until Christ be reformed in you. Or he refers to Moses, begging of God that he himself be damned rather than that the people of Israel be lost. Or he refers to the maternal love of the woman in the story of Solomon. You know, the two women who come both claiming that this child is theirs. And the mother's love for her child is so great that she won't consent for it. You know, when Solomon says, I'll settle this, I'll just divide the child in half, and the real mother, won't. So he has some wonderful things about Mother Charity illustrated in those figures. Let's turn now to another metaphor, the building metaphor. It's noteworthy that any time Augustine cites or alludes to a biblical image of the church as something solid, church is built on a rock, church is a building, and the people might think of it as something external to themselves, he hastens to remind them that it is they themselves who constitute this church. Thus, if the church is a building, it's constructed out of living stones when people are brought to faith in Christ, and charity cements them together to make a strong building. He loved to cite the words of St. Paul, "Holy is the temple of God, which you are. Quod estis vos." Holy is the temple of God, and you can almost see him pointing, which you are. Which you are. Some examples. He's quoting the Psalm. Your holy temple, wonderful in righteousness. Don't think of this temple as extraneous to yourselves, as something apart from yourselves. Love righteousness, and you yourselves are the temple of God. Another passage, another psalm. They shall be conducted with joy and gladness. They shall be ushered into the temple of the King, citing the psalm. And then Augustine. The temple of the King is the church itself. And yet the church enters his temple. Of what is the temple built? The temple is built of the people who enter the temple, who are its living stones, God's believers. These are the ones who will be ushered into the temple of the King. The King's temple stands firm in unity. It's not a tumble-down place or torn apart or divided against itself. The mortar, the cement, binding its stones together is the charity of those who live there. You are the temple of God. The temple of God is composed of living stones. What unites these living stones but charity? Another passage, citing the psalm. The Lord is in his holy place, and what this holy place is, we are told when the psalm speaks of God who makes people of the same way of life dwell together in a house. Those who are of a common mind, those who agree among themselves, these are the Lord's holy place. When the psalm stated that the Lord is in his holy place, we might have wondered where such a place could be, since God is entirely present everywhere and no bodily space can contain him. So the psalm immediately added the phrase that he dwells among the people of the same way of life. It immediately added the phrase to exclude any possibility, Augustine speaking, to exclude any possibility that we might look for God anywhere but in ourselves, and to ensure that by dwelling together in the same way of life in our house, we might desire to be ourselves the place where he deigns to dwell. Another text. We love the beauty of the house of the Lord, the place of the tent of his glory, if that is what we are ourselves. What is the beauty of the house of the Lord, the place of the tent of his glory, if not his temple, about which the apostle says, "For the temple of God is holy, which you are." Just as our bodily gaze is delighted by man-made buildings when they are elegantly and magnificently constructed, in the same way, when the hearts of the faithful, as living stones, are cemented together with the bond of charity, it constitutes the beauty of God's house and the place of the tent of his glory. Learn then what you ought to love so that you may be able to love it. Anyone who loves the beauty of God's house loves the church, not for the craftsmanship of walls and roofs, not for shining marble and gilded ceilings, but for faithful and holy people who love God with all their heart and all their soul and all their mind, and their neighbor as themselves. The same metaphor is extended out, the same is when he now starts talking about the church as a city, because he says a city is, properly speaking, a city is not its buildings, but the people who inhabit it. And he speaks about this city that is now being built, depending upon another verse from another psalm. And he says here, stones are being hewn out of the mountains by the hands of those who preach the truth. And here he's speaking about those who preach the gospel. So their activity is being compared to that of stonemasons who have gone up into the mountain and carved out stones for the building of the church. And these stones are now being squared to fit into that structure. There are still many stones in the builder's hands, meaning God. He does not drop them, for he means to shape them to perfection, ready to be built in with the rest into the fabric of the temple. That house is still being built. That city is still being built. There's a wonderful place where he says, because there's another verse which says that the church is constructed, the building is constructed of square stones. Why square stones? Because you can't knock a square stone over. Okay. And faithful Christians can't be knocked over. Finally, I want to get to the text that was in the title of my talk. One day, St. Augustine was preaching on Psalm 127 in praise of those who walk in the name of the Lord, in the ways of the Lord. One of the blessings such a person will receive is a happy family life. Your wife, like a fruitful vine on the sides of your house, your children, like olive plantings around your table. St. Augustine takes this verse as addressed to Christ, and so the wife in question here must be Christ's church. And his wife, the church, he immediately clarifies, is ourselves. So we are immediately in this psalm. Blessed is the man who follows the ways of the Lord. His wife shall be like a fruitful vine on the sides of the house. This wife is the church. this wife is us. This wife is like a fruitful vine. Augustine then goes on to say, in whom is this vine fruitful? And he gives the reason that he asks, because we see many people, here you're at the Basilica in Hippo, we see many people come within these walls who are barren. We see many come in within them drunk, many who are money lenders or slave dealers, people who consult fortune tellers, people who are running to enchanters or enchantresses whenever they have a headache. In such people, and he's looking out, in such people the church is not a fruitful vine, the church is barren. If Christ's wife is like a fruitful vine, then in whom is she fruitful? Said in quibus. He asks again. And then he goes on in somewhat fanciful exegesis. The church is said, the wife is said to be a fruitful vine on the sides of the house. The sides of the house, the church, and the house consists of people who side with Christ. So the answer must be that it is in those who cling tightly to Christ that the church is a fruitful vine. What I'm interested in here is that when he says, okay, the church is a fruitful vine, he doesn't mean the whole thing. He doesn't mean everybody. He doesn't mean some kind of institution. He means this group of people, and he doesn't even mean all of this group of people. He means the people who are serious Christians. He doesn't mean the drunks. He doesn't mean the people running to fortune tellers. In them, the church is barren. In whom is the church a fruitful vine? Okay. Now, his development of this theme has implicit within it a distinction that Augustine made between the communio sacramentorum and the societas sanctorum. The communio sacramentorum refers to, that means the fellowship or the communion of the sacraments, of the mysteries, if you want. It refers to the church that's described in such biblical images as a field in which you have both wheat and weeds growing, or a net in which both bad fish and good fish are swimming as it's being hauled toward the shore. It's a threshing floor before the winnowing. In other words, it's the church here below, gathered under the Word of God and born of the sacraments. No one else has emphasized more than Augustine the mixed character of this church. Only with the judgment of Christ at the end of the world will wheat and weeds, good fish and bad, grain and chaff be separated. Till then, they are mixed together. But still, it is a church blessed by God with the scriptures, with the sacraments, with practices, with all of those external activities without which you cannot have a religious society. On the other hand, there is the societas sanctorum, the fellowship of holy people. This refers to Christians who are living authentic Christian lives. They are the body of Christ, alive by his Spirit, united by genuine love. St. Augustine never uses the phrase the body of Christ to refer to the whole external reality. The body of Christ refers to those who are living by the Spirit of Christ. It's the Ecclesia in Sanctis, the church that exists in holy people, that consists of holy Christians, who praise God not only with their voices but also with their hearts, not only in appearance but in truth, who are what the church ought to be. They are the true church in the Augustinian sense, for which, as Father Congar put it, the full truth of its existence is realized when a reality becomes what it ought to be. Of any reality, he says, its full truth is realized when it is what it ought to be. And once again here we have ecclesiology, the doctrine of the faith, depending upon theological or spiritual anthropology, insofar as the church exists not as a means of grace or sacrament, but as the totality and the unity of those who live for God and according to God. And for Augustine, it is this fellowship of the holy that is the principal instrument of God's activity in the world. And this is here where we come back, in a way, to this issue. For St. Augustine, it's not the most important thing about the minister of a sacrament is not that the minister of the sacrament does not have does not have power. The power is God's. God is the one who acts in the sacraments. Right? The minister is a minister, an instrument of God. So when, for example, he talks about the keys of Christ says, breathes on them and gives them the Holy Spirit, whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven them. Okay, so it's the Spirit who forgives. Yes, the Spirit forgives through the church, but through which church? Through the holy people in the church. Now, Augustine was certainly of the view that you could not have the fellowship of holy people except within the external community of sacraments. There are not two churches, one invisible, the other visible, even though only God can read hearts and know which Christians truly belong to him. The one church is the community of people who gather under the authority of the Scriptures and by the power of the sacraments, but the church is what the church should be only in good and holy Christians. The whole purpose of Augustine's preaching was to turn this communion, this fellowship of the sacraments, of all of the external activities, into the Societas Sanctorum, to make all of you who are gathered in here into holy people in whom the church properly speaks. It was important for Augustine, certainly, supremely important, that you be in the church, in ecclesia, but what equally important was what the church is in people. So if you want to ask, where is the true church of Christ? A topic that dominated during the Reformation. Where is the true church? The answer given in apologetical theology was to list all of the externals that you need and to say that only the Roman Catholic Church is the true church because it has the complete creed, the complete sacramental system, and the forms of apostolic ministry Christ wished the church to have. All of the criteria are external. We have 7 sacraments, not just 2. We have a full creed. We haven't dropped out any dogmas. We have a full sacramental ordained ministry, deacons, presbyters, bishops, and a pope. No other community can say that. Okay? We are the true church. But that was to ignore the other way in which that question can be asked, which is the question, where is the authentic church? Where by authentic church he means the church in holy people. And that is not a question that's so easy to answer. Joseph Ratzinger pointed out at one point in commenting on the council's teaching on this matter and saying, it really does upend the traditional apologetical argument because it's not sufficient in asking about where is the true church, meaning where is the authentic church, to point to these external factors. You need to look at the heart, and it's quite possible that you could have a Christian community which has fewer of those external constituents but has more of the internal holiness. So you might have, let's say in a town, it could very well be that it's the Methodist or the Pentecostal church which is more authentic than the Catholic Church, even though the Catholic Church has got all of the sacraments and all of those other things, but it's not living the way in which it ought to be. Let me finish now with a reference to Pope Francis, because Pope Francis at one point was doing a catechesis on the church during his Wednesday audience. And at one point he came to the notion of the church as mother, and you may be familiar now with the way in which he develops a homily. There are always 3 points. So Pope Francis said the church is a mother in 3 ways. First of all, because she gives birth to us in faith and in baptism. In faith, because it is from the church that we have received the knowledge of God and of Christ. He himself said elsewhere, "Believe me, without the church I would not have been able to encounter Christ." Taking up the ancient symbol of the baptismal font as the womb of the church, he speaks of baptism as the moment in which we are given the life of God. And as usual, he adds a challenge, having developed this first sense in which the church is a mother. Let us ask ourselves, how do I see the church? If I am grateful to my parents because they gave me life, am I grateful to the church because she has generated me in the faith through baptism? Do we love the church as we love our own mother, knowing and also understanding her defects? All mothers have defects. We all have defects. But when there's talk of our mother's defects, sometimes we cover them up. We love her so. The church also has her defects. Do we nevertheless love her as we do our mother? Do we help to make her more beautiful, more authentic, more according to the Lord? Secondly, the church is a mother by nourishing her children, instructing and correcting them, accompanying them as they grow, and doing all that by transmitting the Word of God and by the sacraments, which leads to questions, again, he can ask of the people he's addressing. What relationship do I have with the church? Do I see her as a mother that helps me grow as a Christian? Do I take part in the life of the church? Do I feel a part of her? Is my relationship with her merely formal or vital? But where many a reflection on the church as mother would leave things there with perhaps an injunction always to remember that mother knows best, the Pope's third point brings this mother language down to earth. And I'm going to quote from Pope Francis on this issue. In the first centuries of the church, one reality was very clear. While the church is mother of Christians, while she makes Christians, she is also composed of them. She is also made by them. The church isn't something different from ourselves, but is seen as the totality of believers, as the we of Christians, W-E. I, you, all of us are part of the church. So all of us, pastors and faithful, live the maternity of the church. Sometimes I hear people say, I believe in God, but not in the church. I've heard that the church says, the priests say, the priests are one thing. Francis says, the priests are one thing, but the church is not made up of priests only. All of us are the church. And if you say that you believe in God and do not believe in the church, you are saying that you don't believe in yourself. And this is a contradiction. All of us are the church, from the recently baptized baby to the bishops, the Pope. We're all the church, and we're all equal in the eyes of God. We are all called to collaborate in the birth of faith of new Christians. We're also called to be educators in the faith, to proclaim the gospel. Each one of us must ask him or herself, what do I do so that others can share the Christian faith? Am I fruitful in my faith or closed? When I say that I love a church Francis says, when I say that I love a church that isn't shut up in some enclosure, but is able to go out, to move, even with some risks, to bring Christ to all, I think of all, of myself, of you, of every one of us, of every Christian. We all participate in the church's maternity, the church's motherhood, so that the light of Christ reaches the ends of the earth. Now, I actually think that Pope Francis wrote that heavily dependent upon what Father Congar had written. There are too many similarities between that talk and an essay of Father Congar on this theme. But it's interesting that here he went to make this point, which I think is precisely St. Augustine's thing. You are all children, each of us. You are all individually children of Mother Church. Do a bit of autobiographical reflection. Who told you about God? Who told you about Christ? Who brought you to believe? Who helped you to take Christianity seriously? Seriously enough that you'd come to a lecture like this on a lovely Saturday morning. Okay. Who helped make you a child of God? Now, you may not be tempted to do this, but there is a sense in which other people did this. Who did it? Your parents? Your grandparents? A teacher in school? A nun? A priest? Who told you about God? Who told you about Christ? Who led you to believe? Who provided a nourishing environment, a matrix in which you could grow and become a serious Christian? If you can identify those people, you know who were your mothers in Christ. Matrix is, of course, a word that depends upon the female thing, the matrix, the womb. Okay. So you can give autobiographical meaning to this, and then, of course, immediately once you start recognizing this, you recognize that your responsibility now is to be yourself a mother that brings others to faith. And who will it be who brings others to faith? People who are living the faith fully, authentically. They themselves will be giving to faith, bringing other people to hear about God because you speak about God, to hear about Christ because you speak about Christ, to be brought to take the Christian message seriously because you take the Christian message seriously. And in all those ways, you now yourself, who are a child of Mother Church, a child of all those who brought you to faith, become yourself the mother for a new generation. So you can see how this theme can develop and it leads to the exploration of a metaphor that, as I said before, has somewhat fallen out of favor, but can be given concrete meaning, and the concrete meaning involves us. Thank you. So, we're open for questions, and we have a microphone someplace that we're going to. But what? Would allow children to? And Pope John Paul II said the church is not a democracy. Okay, the church is not a democracy. If you mean by a democracy something like a modern political system, okay. As we watch things develop, the modern political system can change and can alter its own principles. In that respect, the church is founded upon the preaching of Christ and the preaching about Christ. And that's not up to the vote of the members of the church as, for example, to decide whether they're going to believe in the Holy Trinity. In that sense, it's not. That does not alter the fact that everybody in the church should have and does have a say as to what the church is. And so for me, one of the main problems under Pope John Paul II was that almost all of the instruments for co-responsibility in the Church at every level, from the parish to the entire Church, were allowed to atrophy. And that is a major problem. So I was asked yesterday, what do I think still remains to be done with regard to the Ecclesiology of Vatican II, and I would agree that the main thing is to provide institutions for the co-responsibility of all within the Church. But that would not extend to, in a sense, having a democratic referendum as to whether we're going to believe in the Trinity anymore. And in that sense, the Church is not a democracy. Well, Augustine certainly, he took for granted the essential structure of the Church as he knew it. For example, that the there are ordained ministers, from deacons, presbyters, bishops, etc. He took for granted the fact that the Church in any particular place had to be in communion with the churches in other places, and in particular with the Church in Rome. He took for granted the sacraments, at least of baptism, Eucharist, of a penitential discipline. He took for granted a number of other practices like that of infant baptism. So all of that enters into this description of the communio sacramentorum. So all of, if you might want to say, the quotes unquote objective institutional dimensions. You'll notice, by the way, in neither of my talks, nor I hope in my third talk, do I ever use the phrase the institutional church. I hate that phrase. I hate it because it suggests two things. One, the first reason is because usually what people mean by it is the hierarchy. And as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to be critical of the hierarchy, say the hierarchy. Say the Roman Curia, say the Pope, say bishops, or whatever. Don't call it the institutional church, because the second reason is because it suggests that there is a church that's not institutional, when in fact the church is institutional. The Jordan lectures are an institution. You have gathered here to take part in an institution, the Jordan lectures. Okay. Back in the days when there were consciousness-raising seminars being held all over the place, a consciousness-raising seminar, which is for the sake of the liberation of women, for example, from feelings of oppression, a consciousness-raising seminar is an institution. And I think that often enough it's not that people don't give enough reflection upon the fact that institutions are not necessarily bad things. You can have institutions that serve freedom. And that's the other reason I don't like it. So, all of those things enter in. Now, I get back to your question. So he took those things for granted, but they are not the primary things. And what I'm trying to get across is that the church, all of these quotes unquote externals, all of these institutions serve something internal, authenticity. And there's no substitute for an authentic church. And there's nothing worse as a countersign to Christ than an inauthentic church, as I'll be talking about this afternoon. But whether the church is authentic, whether the church is the true church of Christ, depends to a good degree also on us. So, yes.
That the
Okay. Okay, I suppose I brought this on myself because I referred to Pope Francis. I think he is struggling to respond to an ever more insistent claim that women have to have a greater role in the life of the church. And he's used a couple of disparaging remarks. He says, I don't want a clericalism in skirts. He doesn't want the question of the contribution women can make to the life of the church reduced to their occupying clerical roles. Okay. Now, when he says women are more important, he actually refers to Hans Urs von Balthasar's distinction between what he calls the Marian principle in the church, the principle of the church that imitates and realizes what Mary did, as distinct from the Petrine or the apostolic function. And so I think he is still struggling. I don't think he fully appreciates the passion with which these questions about women's role in the church are being raised. You know, I do think, there is. So I think, that's the best I can do. Yes?
Father, is the image of the church in the Psalms, Augustine's commentaries on the Psalms, would you say that you find the same vision of the church in the city of God?
Yes, the question is, do I see the same thing in the notion of the church as the city of God?
I'm talking about Augustine's book, The City of God.
Oh, yes, I think so. I have concentrated on his preaching. Yes, you do, but there is, of course, the tremendous debate as to what is the relationship between the city of God and the church. And I agree with those people who say it's an inadequate distinction because it's going to come down to what do you mean by the city of God and what do you mean by the church. But I think I would want to maintain that what I set out here, that the most important thing about the city of God is who lives in it and who are the city of God. And for him, the city of God is determined by loves. Two loves created two cities. One love of self created the city of man. The other love of God, above all things, created the city of God. The city of God consists of people who are themselves in love with God. So I do think you could make the case that in the city of God at greater length is the same notion. Yes.
I'm just wondering, the account of the church that you give us as members of that church, a much greater responsibility in Christ that we might sometimes think of. And I'm just wondering, how can that be lived out in the context of a North American parish where we tend to pick up a kind of individualism, almost by osmosis, and we're engaged in the church. We can often go to our parish every week without really knowing the other members of that community, beyond saying hello or shaking hands. How do we appropriate that richer notion in that kind of ecclesial context?
Well, you have to, overcoming the individualism that's rampant in North America has to be done by asking the kinds of questions I asked before. Who brought you to the faith? And if you want to say, I was baptized as a child, I didn't have anything to do with it. Well, you're not a child anymore, you're an adult. Who led you to take your faith seriously as an adult and to start recognizing the degree to which our Christianity, even in many of its most intimate aspects, is something that has been mediated to us by other people who believed before us or who believe alongside us. how difficult it would be to be the last remaining Christian believer on earth. Okay? I am strengthened by your being here. You are strengthened by those who are sitting next to you in the pew. So you have to overcome it. That's in part that way. And then you have to try to provide opportunities within a parish or within a community for people to experience that themselves. That's about the best I can think of. Okay, last question, way in the back.
Okay, I appreciate you talking about the reification case, seeing the church as this entity over against the totality of the members. But I wanted to ask, we understand that Christ as the new Adam falls asleep on the cross and his wife comes out of his side. And there's the traditional understanding that the water is the blood of sacrament. And I wonder how we can talk about that, like the sacrament as the church, without being guilty of reification. Specifically, G.K. Chesterton has a quote to the effect that even if all the Christians on earth were to die or church was absent from the earth, somehow church would still exist there because the sacrament, even if there were no individual Christians. And I'm wondering, does a statement like that, is that guilty of reification? Is that guilty of creating these distinctions you identify? Or is there a way to confirm that the church is present in the sacraments, distinct from its members without differentiating them or reaffirming something else?
Okay. The image with which you began, I have in my notes, but I skipped it in going through here. St. Augustine followed earlier patristic tradition in comparing exegeting the scene in John's Gospel where the soldier pierces the side of Christ on the cross. Christ has died, the soldier pierces his side, and outflow water and blood. And the tradition was seeing the water as the water of baptism, the blood of the Eucharist. These are the two principal sacraments that make the church, and so what flows from the side of Christ sleeping on the cross is the church. And Adam's being sleeping as God takes Eve from his side in the book of Genesis becomes a type of the emergence of the church out of the sacrifice of Christ and in the sacraments. So you can make statements of that sort and talk about the sacraments. But my question is, does the sacrament exist? When does the sacrament exist? Well, I don't know what that means. The church, because does the sacrament exist except when it's being performed? So I don't know what it means to say that you don't have any Christians left on earth, but the church continues to exist. What is this church that it continues to exist? You say, well, it exists in the sacraments. What are these sacraments that are not being performed? What is baptism? If you say the church is built upon baptism, that refers to an action. No?
When you say that it's present in potential because...
Oh, well, that's another... Yes. Yes, you could. I mean, and if you want to make the case is that, for example, water baptism is still an essential, is the essential rite by which a person enters the church. There's no question there. And so you could say, well, this is constitutive of the church, but that's a description of what ought to be the case. It's a bit like the if you want the score of a symphony, okay? But the symphony doesn't exist except when it's being played. And so Beethoven's Fifth doesn't exist. There are some black marks on white paper that will tell you what it's supposed to be, but it takes the orchestra to start playing it for Beethoven's Fifth to exist. So a sacrament has to be performed in order to exist. It doesn't exist apart from the performance, and the performance involves actual people. I at least that's what I think, okay, in answer to your question. I realize I have all kinds of notes. I have a file on my computer. What sort of entity is the church? And that's where I I actually have a section there on whether the sacraments exist.